August 24, 1977. England, Dover, Potter Hall. Magical funerals weren't particularly different from the most ordinary ones, except that the English were more reserved. No one openly wept, there was no music, and the Potters were laid to rest in the family mausoleum crypt, resembling a small mausoleum of Lenin made from grey stone. Sergei glanced at his pale friend walking beside him, paying his last respects to the uncle and aunt who had died nearly simultaneously. A few days ago, an owl had arrived at the Black House with the news of Doria Potter's passing. She, in her maiden days, had carried the surname Black and was Sirius's second cousin grandmother, though she was only about 5 years older than his mother. No one knew what had happened, perhaps it was not deemed proper to announce, or something else entirely, but Carlos Potter had died shortly after his wife. They were buried together. As Sergei understood it, old families harbored different secrets and did not release the bodies to the relatives for cause of death determination. Although he was curious about how two wizards who looked quite young and were 57 years old had simultaneously passed away. Many relatives gathered at the ceremony. Sergei saw his older cousins for the first time, the blonde Narcissa, who shortly before his arrival in the previous world of magic had married Lucius Malfoy. Lucius himself wasn't present at the funeral, but Sirius remembered him as the proud blonde heartthrob. Furthermore, Lucius was, is, and remains a follower of the Dark Lord, about whom there had been a lot of whispering at school in the days leading up to the summer holidays. Rumors circulated that this very Dark Lord was amassing an army and inviting young Slytherins to join it as the nation's stronghold. The magical war began back in 73. Newspapers occasionally wrote about attacks on Muggles, Muggleborns, and law enforcement, but lately the flow of articles about gruesome atrocities had dwindled. Though rumors had surfaced that it wasn't that the murders had decreased, the killers and the Death Eaters had just become better at concealing themselves. Furthermore, they had intimidated journalists, infiltrated the government with their supporters, making it so that no one could be trusted. Anyone you knew might be under the Imperious curse, and the moment you turned away, a curse could be sent at your back. At Hogwarts, due to these rumors, the rivalry between Slytherin and Gryffindor houses had intensified even further. One side didn't believe, the other did. Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff tried to maintain neutrality, but they too were swayed in different directions. Bellatrix, who, according to Sirius's memories, was a deranged witch obsessed with the Dark Lord, gave the impression of a quite respectable lady. Sergei was slightly shocked when his cousin Bellatrix almost immediately approached him, inquiring about his well-being. She explained that she knew that her little cousin spent a lot of time at their grandmother's house. After the close encounter with Sergei's cousin, memories flooded in about how Bellatrix had married Rodolphus Lestrange in 73. As far as Sirius remembered, his older cousin's wedding had been rather hasty due to the fact that his Muggleborn Tonks cousin, Andromeda, had married Ted Tonks. Sergei had difficulty grasping the core of it, but it seemed to involve some sort of ritual. Initially, the groom for Bellatrix had been her husband's younger brother, Rabastan, but the older of the brothers was required for the ritual. Bellatrix sacrificed her own happiness, it seemed, to save her sister and father. For that, Sirius held contempt for Bellatrix.
They were in Cokeworth recently. It's a Muggle town,
James said, playing with the Snitch. Sergei had long noticed this habit of his friends, fiddling with the Snitch, when he was upset or lost in thought. Since his second year, James had been the Gryffindor Quidditch team's seeker, but by his 5th year, he'd lost his agility and quickness, especially with the appearance of another nimble boy, Russell Wadcock, a minor celebrity and the grandson of the talented Quidditch player Rosalind Wadcock. James had been moved to the position of chaser and, to appease him, made the team captain. However, by the end of the year, Gryffindor had won the school cup by a wide margin, so Potter didn't seem to be holding a grudge.
You mean? I mean Aunt Doria and Uncle Carlos. The Evans family lives in Cokeworth, Lily's family. Aunt and Uncle were there. Wanted to find out. You know, Aunt was very principled about blood purity matters. Perhaps, indirectly, I'm to blame for their deaths.
But why? Sergei asked cautiously.
They could have been tracked down by the Death Eaters or... I don't know.
James exhaled and averted his gaze, clearly withholding something. They fell silent.
Sirius, I've decided to tell everyone at school that my parents died. They were like parents to me.
After a long pause, James revealed, putting his snitch in his pocket.
Besides, it's better this way. For everyone.
What about Aunt Euphemia and Uncle Flemont? Sergei wondered. He, of course, knew about this arrangement from the future past, but he couldn't comprehend it. It was as if some detail was missing. In Sirius's memory, almost nothing remained of that day. He hadn't attended the funeral, avoiding his family, and had been at Godric's Hollow, in the house that had been inherited from his deceased Uncle Alfred. However, today that very uncle, his mother's brother, was among others at the Potter's funeral, and it seemed he wasn't planning to die. But perhaps the circumstances changed due to the fact that when Sirius and Uncle Alfred had met during the Christmas holidays, he had asked about his health and suggested he go to a resort or receive treatment at St. Mungo's. As for James's strange idea, of course, the magical community was quite closed and conservative. Only Blacks and the elder Potter's children were present at the funeral, but rumors would still spread somehow. If James didn't want Lily to be stressed now or something else, the truth would come out eventually. James frowned and turned away.
Father and mother are going on a journey. They're unlikely to return to Britain.
What? Sergei exclaimed, looking into his friend's brown eyes.
It's necessary, Sirius, better not to ask.
James' lips twisted into a semblance of a smile.
Father set up an account for me and put 25,000 galleons there with interest. Since this March, I'm of legal age and don't need guardianship. I've also been allocated an amount to buy a house. I'm moving out. I have nothing more to do here.
But how? Sergei was taken aback.
Potter Hall belongs to others now.
Feigning indifference, James shrugged.
My cousin has her own family, and... it's better this way. I'll be able to date Lily in peace. Besides, I'll have my own house. Although I still don't know where to buy it. Maybe in Hogsmeade. Then I can go there on weekends.
Seems like real estate there is quite expensive, Sergei replied mechanically, as a family acquaintance who had visited them recently had mentioned it. Plus, your house will always be in plain sight. I don't know. But on the other hand, mountain air.
Right, and constant chilliness. No, thank you. I prefer the south. Plus, I don't have that much money for a house.
James scratched his messy hair.
There's another option with Godric's Hollow. Many wizards live there, but it's next to Muggles. Despite a fairly good magical background, the houses there aren't very expensive due to that.
Yes, Uncle Alfred lives there, Sergei nodded. He seems to like it there.
Also, Godric's Hollow is on the other side of the strait and is as far away from Dover as possible. Decided. And you'll be able to visit me and your uncle. By the way, maybe he'll help me with the purchase?
Well. Let's go ask, Sergei shrugged. There weren't any traditional wakes for wizards. After the funeral, everyone quickly left Potter Hall through the fireplace. Sergei stayed to support his friend, who was genuinely grieving. Sergei's mother allowed James to stay with them during this time. The Potter household was truly bustling. James was packing his things, and his parents were as well. Magical moving was distinctive only in that everything fit into a relatively small suitcase. While preparations were underway, Sergei settled into one of the armchairs near the window. Out of a recently formed habit, he took out his watch, the one he had found in the Black House, the one with the sundial. In more than a year of his stay in the magical world, the clock had moved 36 minutes. He had realized that when it completed a full revolution, everything would end. But there was still plenty of time, and the clock confirmed that. The second hand ticked in rhythm with his heartbeat, but didn't move. Almost. The 6th year flew by incredibly fast. After the Christmas break, days blurred into days. In January, Snape turned 17 and received his potion-making license. In early February, during the full moons, Remus Lupin tried the Wolfbane potion and remained sane throughout the night. By the way, thanks to normal clothes, a new hairstyle, and his earned license, Snape became quite popular among the female senior students. Sergei recalled that the Slytherin head of house had invited Snape to some party for his club. The blasted Snape declined, citing being busy. However, that was true. Snape was doing his best, working on some calculations and coming up with something. During the Easter holidays, which were from the 2nd to the 16th of April, Snape suddenly called Sergei to talk and awkwardly invited him and Regulus to the Prince mansion. He showed them a letter from Mr. Prince, who had sent the invitation, having agreed in advance that if Snape brought along his friends, the Blacks, he'd accept. Sergei managed to find out that Mr. Prince had initiated contact with his grandson after the release of an article about Snape's patent in a specialized potion-making journal. He had sent an almost business-like formal letter with questions about the article and the recipe itself. Severus Prince was a master of potion-making and had become interested in the methodology. Correspondence between the young and the old potion-makers ensued, and then an unexpected invitation to visit followed. Snape clearly didn't want to go to an unfamiliar house alone, and their relationship with Sergei was steady, friendly, so he agreed. However, he agreed only for a few days so that he could later go with his brother to his parents. The Prince Mansion was located in South Wales, an ancient house with columns that somewhat resembled the Samba Palace of Culture. Nevertheless, the reception was decent, though the first dinner was a bit tense. However, after that, all the potion makers, including Regulus, somehow found common ground. Sergei even managed to squeeze into a scientific debate about his project of a motorcycle with dragon's blood as fuel. He managed to pique Mr. Prince's interest, who promised to consider the task. Just before the news of the Potter's demise arrived, Sergei received a letter from Snape. He wrote that Mr. Prince wanted to teach him to become a master of potions and that he might not continue his education at Hogwarts, to not waste time. He would only come for the final Newt exams at the end of the 7th year. Attached to the letter was a recipe and explanations of what this fuel should achieve for his artifact to run on magic. Snape didn't promise 100 miles per hour, but a speed of around 80 could be achieved.
I'm ready.
Have you said your goodbyes already?
Yeah, let's go, Sirius. Let this farewell evening finally end.
James smiled sadly.
April 6, 1978. Scotland, Hogwarts. On Thursday, Peter struggled to wake up after an almost sleepless night spent pondering his fate and the fate of his companions. Luckily, the 7th-year schedule only had classes on Mondays and Fridays. Missing breakfast wasn't that bad either, since during the Easter holidays, his mother had baked and packed an enormous bag of ginger cookies for him. These cookies could even last for a month without special preservation charms. It seemed that she wanted to give him something to occupy his time and not. Peter squinted and hesitated to finish his thought, diverting his attention. It was truly incredible how quickly his time at the magical school had come to an end. Almost 7 years had flown by like mere days. In just 2.5 months, they would have to take their final exams and move on to adult life. Today, aside from history of magic and numerology, there were potions with Slughorn. The old Slytherin head of house would probably start pestering Snape again, even though they were somewhat on equal footing. Snape was a rare nuisance. After the incident with the potion for werewolves, which had helped Remus so much, Snape had acquired a real enemy in the form of his head of house. Peter hadn't even suspected that the chubby and easygoing old Sluggy, who seemed to be interested only in various sweets in his slug club, could be so unpleasant and vindictive. When Snape faced the question of membership and the opportunity to freely attend the 7th year, it was apparently Slughorn, as the Slytherin head of house, who opposed it. he said that either the smartest Snape would take a certificate of incomplete magical education or he would study like everyone else without receiving any privileges. Snape had chosen to finish the 7th year, and every potions lesson was met with attacks from his head of house. Slughorn went out of his way to find ways to jab at or hurt his student. Not even James, who openly disliked Snape, was pleased with this decision or the nearly unveiled mocking from the teacher. Lily Evans, with whom James was dating, had been Snape's friend. After Christmas last year, when Snape had undergone a strange transformation, he started to appeal to girls and didn't even pay attention to Evans. The situation with Snape had somehow changed. He had begun to attract girls and didn't even glance at Evans, who seemed to be getting along quite well with James. Peter hardly communicated with the first beauty of Gryffindor. But after Lily Evans officially became Potter's girlfriend at the beginning of 7th year, Peter ended up receiving scraps of her attention and Christmas presents. Thinking about the presents, Peter frowned and turned to his side, pondering the same thing for the umpteenth time. After their 5th year, the dynamics of the Marauders changed. They had undergone some shifts even before, such as when Peter had mastered Animagus transformation alongside Sirius and James. At that time, it seemed like his friends had started to respect and consider him a bit more equal. It was pleasant to be acknowledged. However, during their 6th year, Sirius Black, who was always unpredictable and capricious, suddenly grew tired of their full moon games. They no longer gathered as a group of 4, they didn't transform into animals, and they didn't spend time together as friends. Later, it turned out that Sirius had decided to take a more serious approach to Remus's problem. He had promoted and sponsored Snape for that potion. Furthermore, Black in general had become calmer, gentler, and more thoughtful. Surprisingly, the Christmas presents from him were pleasant and genuinely useful. Last year, Black even remembered Peter's birthday, which was in the summer after the exams. None of his friends had congratulated him before that, and Peter even wondered if they knew when his birthday was. But Black congratulated him and gave him a good present. Over the past year and a half, Peter could even have a conversation with him that wasn't about studying or pranks, just about life. This made the whole situation he was in even more unpleasant, and he had been pondering it for 3 days now. Perhaps a year ago, he wouldn't have thought about it much, but at this moment, Peter had no idea what to do. He believed he knew what was good and what was evil, but what he had learned on Sunday after they returned to Hogwarts from the break had turned his understanding of everything and everyone upside down. It all began on that late evening when Professor Dumbledore had asked James Potter to come to his office behind the teacher's table in the Great Hall to tell him something. Peter was aware of that office, and he transformed into a rat amidst the crowd of sleep-deprived students leaving a very late dinner and slipped into the room before even Dumbledore and James. Dumbledore had frozen all the portraits in the office and cast numerous spells. It became clear to Peter why such precautions were taken, and he overheard things that were not meant for strangers' ears.
"Hey, Peter, are you up?"
Sirius's voice suddenly came from behind the drawn curtains of the bed. Lost in thoughts and memories, Peter hadn't even heard his roommates returning to the room. Yeah, he pushed aside the heavy velvet curtains and saw that only Black was in the room. Then he remembered that James had Quidditch practice today, and Remus had probably gone to the library after breakfast to start preparing for the exams.
"I brought you breakfast, eat up."
Sirius interrupted Peter's thoughts again. Black enlarged a rather large tray, which held sandwiches, tea, scrambled eggs, jam-covered toast, and an apple. "Is this for me?" Peter was taken aback by this display of care from Black.
"Yes."
Sirius seemed a bit embarrassed.
"You know, my family has connections in the Aura office. I know what happened to your father. My mother wrote to me. I'm sorry. Why didn't you say anything?"
"There's nothing to talk about," Peter shrugged, turning away and trying his best not to sniffle. His nose had become instantly wet from Black's words.
"But he was murdered."
Sirius placed the tray on the nightstand and sat down on Peter's bed.
It's serious. And there's something to talk about.
There's no magic in his death, Peter said with a wry smile, quoting the words of one of the Aurors.
Your father was a wizard. Why didn't they investigate?
He was a Muggle-born and practically left the magical world. He was stabbed near his workplace. My mother and I were told that he probably witnessed some mafia disputes at the docks. He worked there, Peter choked up. He was telling and telling. About his family, his mother, his childhood, about his father, Sam Pettigrew, who had died just 3 weeks ago and whose death he still couldn't come to terms with. Peter's parents were Muggle-born wizards who had graduated from Hogwarts and were sorted into Gryffindor and Ravenclaw. However, they couldn't establish themselves in the magical world afterward. There was no place for people like them, and in the Muggle world after the war, there were many unemployed, although their family managed to survive. His mother worked as a stenographer typist, and his father worked at the docks. Despite the low income, the tiny apartment, and the not-so-prestigious neighborhood, they lived well and harmoniously. Peter's parents loved him deeply and had certain hopes for him, as he was already considered a pure-blood wizard in the second generation, which meant he could work at the Ministry of Magic or even start his own business, for which, according to magical laws, one needed to be pure-blood in the first generation or at least half-blood. On March 15th, while Peter was visiting his parents during the Easter break, his father didn't return from work. His mother was worried and anxious. They even performed a search ritual, the result of which left them shocked. The next morning, a constable came to them, confirming that they had found Sam Pettigrew dead near the London port. The Muggle police investigator speculated that Peter's father had become an accidental witness to mafia disputes at the docks and was taken care of. When the Aurors were called, they just shrugged and said they don't interfere in Muggle affairs and there was nothing magical about the death of Sam Pettigrew, who had been stabbed with an ordinary knife. Sirius listened attentively, asking clarifying questions.
You know, there are certain rituals and spells that can shed light on what happened to your father and who's responsible for his death.
Black summarized after Peter's almost hour-long outpouring.
They don't even seem to fall under the forbidden category. And it's not like they're rare and unknown. At Hogwarts, of course, they're not taught, but from what my mother said, we're currently undergoing some sort of reform, and about half of the curriculum is being crossed out by the ministry. Just remember that Magizoology was simply turned into Magical Creature Care, cutting the program by 2/3, making it something even our gamekeeper Hagrid could teach. Or after the 5th year, they combined Magical Male Studies and Magical Female Studies into one general subject, Charms. Your father might have been Muggle-born, but just a couple of years ago, they were shouting that we were in the midst of a magical war, that people like your parents were being killed, and all that. His death, on the contrary, should have been investigated with great enthusiasm. At least they should have tried to console you and your mother, I don't know. It's hard to say what to console, but somehow ensure that those responsible for a wizard's death are punished.
Thank you, Sirius, Peter sighed. He actually felt a bit relieved. At least in the part that had been burdened by his father's death and the inability to share it. James Potter had lost his parents last summer, just before starting his 7th year, but Peter couldn't fathom the difference between their losses. And now, when Sirius Black suddenly showed so much concern and understanding, it made Peter think even more. James was Sirius's best friend. It was unclear whether he'd believe Peter if he told him, but not saying anything would be quite mean.
We'll finish Hogwarts, and I think I'll be able to perform this ritual myself, since our valiant guardians of order, as usual, are sitting on their hands. We'll find those who killed your father, Pete. I don't like injustice. Especially considering that Newham isn't far from Southwark. We'll get to the bottom of this.
Sirius, Peter finally gathered his courage, squinting his eyes tightly shut, I need to tell you something very important. Your whole family is in grave danger. I don't know if you'll believe me, but it seems like there's a real conspiracy against the Blacks. I found out accidentally. And I learned something about James, and it's all so tangled up. I initially didn't want to tell anyone, but you? I don't want anything to happen to you or your relatives. You might not believe me, I didn't believe it myself when I heard it.
Wait, Pete.
Sirius's hand rested on his shoulder.
I'm going to seal the doors now, so that no one can eavesdrop on us, and then you'll tell me everything. Step by step. All right?
Oh, okay, Peter nodded, staring at Black's face, which he had never seen so serious before. And then Sirius began to deftly wave his wand, tracing intricate runes and patterns, as if trying to turn their room into a Gringotts vault. Nevertheless, Peter was glad that Black was taking this seriously. He certainly didn't relish getting involved with the personal enemies of the brightest wizard of the century. There was no possibility of staying on the sidelines, and he'd have to engage in this game, using all the pawns, most of which would be devoured by the enemies. So, the sooner he chose a side, the better.
Now, tell me.
Sirius concluded with his protective measures.